President Donald Trump on Tuesday signed the Border Infrastructure National Security Directive, declaring emergency control over 26 U.S.-Canada crossings in a move the White House said was aimed at increasing pressure in trade talks, immediately triggering constitutional warnings from legal scholars and a sharp sell-off in markets. The directive, announced in Washington, gave the administration authority to restrict or reroute commercial traffic at key border points, a step critics said amounted to gaslighting the limits of presidential power. The administration framed the order as a national security measure tied to border resilience and supply chain protection, but the practical effect was obvious within minutes. Businesses that depend on daily cross-border movement started pricing in delays, higher costs, and possible retaliation from Ottawa. Traders did not wait for a briefing. They moved first, with transportation and industrial shares taking the hit as investors tried to figure out whether this was policy or a reality TV stunt with federal letterhead. The scale matters. The 26 crossings targeted by the directive handle a large share of U.S.-Canada commercial traffic, including trucks carrying autos, energy components, agricultural goods, and manufacturing inputs. Any disruption there would hit both sides of the border fast, and that is exactly why critics called the order less a security move than a leverage play dressed up as emergency management. One trade analyst described the action as a direct attempt to weaponize infrastructure that both countries rely on every day. Constitutional alarm followed almost immediately. Legal experts said the directive raised serious questions about whether the president can unilaterally seize operational control over border infrastructure without congressional authorization, especially when the stated purpose is to pressure a trading partner. The move also revived a familiar fight over emergency powers, with opponents arguing that Trump was again testing how far he could push executive authority before the courts or Congress stepped in. Business groups were blunt about the risk. Logistics firms warned that even a short disruption could ripple through auto assembly lines, food distribution, and energy supply chains, while exporters on both sides of the border braced for delays. The market response reflected that fear, with volatility rising as investors tried to separate actual border security from what one analyst called trade coercion in a trench coat. Inside Washington, the reaction was not wait and see. Lawmakers from both parties began drafting fast-track measures to block or limit the directive, and committee staff moved to determine whether Congress could strip the administration's authority before the order was fully implemented. Congress moves fast to stop him. Legal scholars, automakers, farmers, and logistics groups spent Wednesday warning that President Donald Trump's border directive was not a security fix but an unconstitutional power grab that could rattle roughly $400 billion in annual U.S.-Canada commerce. Their message was blunt. If the White House starts treating shared infrastructure like a political prop, the bill lands on assembly lines, grain elevators, and freight yards first. Constitutional experts said the order pushed past the normal limits of executive power by trying to control crossings that sit at the center of a bilateral trading system, not a wartime command structure. According to several law professors, the administration would need far clearer congressional authority before it could justify rerouting commercial traffic at scale, especially when the stated goal is to pressure Canada in negotiations. One scholar called the move a stress test for the Constitution, while another said it looked like gaslighting with federal stationery. Business groups did not bother with courtroom poetry. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce said any prolonged interference at the border would hit a trade corridor that moves auto parts, energy equipment, agricultural shipments, and time-sensitive manufactured goods every day. Logistics executives warned that even short delays could trigger missed delivery windows, higher storage costs, and production stoppages, because modern supply chains do not wait around for a presidential mood swing. Automakers were among the loudest voices, and for good reason. The North American car industry runs on cross-border parts movement that can cross the border multiple times before a vehicle is finished, which means a slowdown at one checkpoint can snowball across plants in Michigan, Ontario, and beyond. Industry representatives said the order could force companies to hold more inventory, reroute trucks, and absorb higher costs at a time when margins are already tight. Farm groups said the directive could be just as disruptive in the food system, where timing is everything and delays can spoil margins fast. Grain, livestock, fertilizer, and refrigerated products all rely on predictable border flow. And producers warned that uncertainty alone can be enough to raise costs before a single truck is stopped. One agricultural trade official said the administration was effectively asking farmers to eat the chaos first and argue later. Logistics operators added that the damage would not stay on one side of the border. Freight brokers, warehouse managers, and customs specialists said the crossings targeted by the directive are part of a tightly synchronized network, so a slowdown in one lane can jam the entire chain behind it. That is why the figure getting repeated in Washington is not just 26 crossings, but an estimated $400 billion in annual commerce that could be exposed to delays, rerouting, and retaliation. The political reaction sharpened the same day, with lawmakers from both parties beginning to ask whether the White House had created a crisis faster than it could manage one. Behind closed doors, aides said committee staff were already comparing the directive to prior emergency power fights, looking for a legislative hook to limit or reverse it before the administration could normalize the order. The White House, meanwhile, kept insisting the move was about security, not trade theater. But that defense was already fraying as the criticism widened beyond the usual suspects. In the Senate, one Republican broke ranks. Sen. Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada helped trigger a bipartisan backlash on Capitol Hill on Tuesday after the White House order targeting U.S.-Canada crossings set off alarms in Michigan, where lawmakers warned that jobs, auto production, and the daily traffic through the Ambassador Bridge could all take a hit within hours. The alliance widened as Republicans and Democrats alike began treating the directive less like a border security move and more like a direct threat to a critical industrial corridor. Cortez Masto, who has spent years positioning herself as a pragmatic dealmaker, was among the first senators to say the administration had crossed a line. According to her office, she argued that the order risked needless disruption to commerce and would punish workers far from Washington who have no role in trade fights or immigration theater. Her warning landed fast because the Michigan angle was impossible to ignore. The state's manufacturers depend on smooth cross-border movement, and even brief slowdowns can ripple through assembly lines, parts warehouses, and trucking schedules. In Lansing and Washington, the reaction hardened around a simple point. The Ambassador Bridge is not a talking point. It is a pressure valve. Lawmakers representing auto-heavy districts said the bridge carries a steady flow of components that can move back and forth multiple times before a vehicle is complete, which means any bottleneck can hit suppliers first and workers second. One Senate aide described the order as gaslighting with a federal seal because it claimed to protect security while putting real-world production at risk. Michigan Democrats moved quickly, but they were not alone for long. Republican lawmakers with manufacturing and border state constituencies started hearing from local business leaders, customs brokers, and union officials who said the directive would not stay neatly confined to a political message board. The concern was practical, not abstract. Missed delivery windows, higher freight costs, and the kind of cascading delays that can force companies to idle shifts or pay premium rates just to keep parts moving. That is where the revolt began to take shape. A small group of senators started comparing notes on possible legislative responses, including oversight demands and measures that could narrow the order's reach before it became routine. Staff on both sides of the aisle said the mood changed once members realized the White House was not just testing a legal theory, it was testing whether Congress would let a president put a hand on the nation's busiest commercial arteries and call it leverage. The White House kept insisting the directive was about national security, but that line was already losing altitude in the chamber. Lawmakers from border and manufacturing states said the order looked less like a strategy and more like a self-inflicted wound dressed up as toughness, the kind of move that sounds decisive on TV and looks reckless in a district with payrolls due Friday. For Cortez Masto and the lawmakers now circling with her, the question was no longer whether the administration had created a problem. The question was how quickly Congress could stop it before the damage spread. The alliance grows within hours. As 7 states filed suit and corporate warnings hardened into full-blown alarms, Congress moved at high speed on Wednesday to pass the Border Commerce Protection Act. a measure designed to restore lawmakers' authority over international crossings after the administration's directive triggered a widening political and economic backlash. The lawsuits, announced in federal court by state attorneys general from both parties, argued that the White House had overstepped its power by trying to control cross-border commerce through emergency authority. The most serious corporate warnings came from sectors that cannot simply shrug and move on. Auto suppliers, agricultural exporters, and freight operators said even a short disruption at key crossings could choke inventory flows, stall assembly schedules, and push customers toward alternate routes that are slower and more expensive. In a statement circulated to lawmakers, one trade association said the administration was treating international commerce like a political prop, not a functioning system with payrolls, contracts, and delivery windows attached. Inside Congress, the response turned procedural and fast. Senate and House leaders began circulating language for the Border Commerce Protection Act, a bill that would narrow the executive's ability to interfere with international crossings without explicit congressional approval. Staff on both sides said the goal was simple: shut down the legal gray zone before the White House could normalize it. The bill quickly became a magnet for lawmakers who had been uneasy for days but had not yet picked a side publicly. Republicans from manufacturing states, Democrats from border districts, and members with heavy freight traffic in their states all began pressing for a vote, arguing that the dispute had moved beyond partisan messaging. According to aides familiar with the talks, the question was no longer whether Congress should act, but whether it could act fast enough to matter. That urgency came from the corporate side, too. Executives warned that uncertainty alone was enough to change behavior, because shipping contracts, staffing schedules, and production orders are built on predictability, not improvisation. One industry source said the administration had created a POV-level disaster for planning teams, forcing them to model scenarios that should never have existed in the first place. The White House, for its part, kept defending the directive as a security measure, but that defense was getting less convincing by the hour. Lawmakers said the administration was trying to sell the power grab as a safeguard, and the more companies spoke out, the more the argument looked like a test case for presidential reach rather than a serious border policy. In private, several senators said the real issue was whether Congress would accept being reduced to a spectator while the executive branch rewrote the rules. By late afternoon, the vote had become bigger than the bill itself. Supporters framed the Border Commerce Protection Act as a necessary correction, while critics warned it could strip the president of flexibility in a crisis. Either way, the chamber was no longer debating a single directive. The vote became a referendum on power. On Tuesday afternoon in Washington, the Senate and House moved in lockstep to pass the Border Commerce Protection Act with decisive bipartisan majorities. After Canada chose not to retaliate and instead kept crossings open, a restraint that left Washington staring at the damage of its own making. The vote, which came after days of legal threats, corporate warnings, and public pressure from freight and manufacturing states, made clear that Congress was no longer willing to let the White House improvise its way through a cross-border crisis. In the Senate, the bill cleared with support from Republicans and Democrats who had spent the week hearing from automakers, farm groups, and logistics operators that even a short disruption would hit inventory, assembly schedules, and delivery contracts. In the House, the margin was just as blunt, with lawmakers from border states and industrial districts joining a bloc of moderates who said the administration had crossed from policy into gaslighting. One senior aide described the final whip count as the kind of bipartisan number you only see when members think the alternative is a mess they'll own in public. The legislation is designed to strip the executive branch of any claim that it can unilaterally interfere with international crossings without explicit congressional approval. Staffers said the bill was written to close the loophole fast, before the White House could normalize emergency authority as a standing tool for trade pressure. That urgency reflected a broader fear on Capitol Hill if the directive survived long enough to become precedent. Every future border dispute would come with a built-in threat of political leverage over commerce. Canada, meanwhile, refused to meet the moment with escalation. Officials in Ottawa kept the tone measured, avoided tariff threats, and reiterated that the crossings would remain open as long as safety and customs rules were followed. The message was simple: no drama, no tit for tat, no Karen routine dressed up as diplomacy. Canadian ministers argued that the best response was to keep the system functioning and let Washington explain why it had created a crisis around infrastructure that both economies depend on every day. That restraint changed the optics fast. Instead of a bilateral showdown, the story became a one-sided failure of judgment, with Canada looking steady and the United States looking like it had picked a fight with its own supply chain. Business groups in both countries said the contrast mattered because markets punish uncertainty, not rhetoric, and the White House had just manufactured a lot of it for no strategic gain. By the time the votes were counted, the political damage was already larger than the directive itself. Senators privately said the result should be read as a warning shot, not a one-off rebuke. Several lawmakers noted that the White House had framed the move as a security measure, but the bipartisan margin suggested Congress saw something else, an attempt to use emergency powers as a shortcut around normal oversight. If you can shut down commerce first and ask questions later, then the Constitution becomes a suggestion, one member said after the vote, adding that the chamber had no interest in letting that standard stand. Market analysts also began recalibrating the fallout. With Canada declining to escalate, attention shifted to the domestic cost of the directive, including legal exposure, investor unease, and the possibility that companies would start treating U.S. border policy as a political risk factor rather than a stable operating assumption. The directive collapsed under its own legal weight on Wednesday in Washington as Congress moved to block the order and keep the 26 U.S.-Canada crossings open, ending the episode with a blunt reminder that executive power still has constitutional limits. The result was less a diplomatic victory than a systems check. The bridges stayed open, commerce kept moving, and the White House was forced to watch its own escalation get shut down by law. By late evening, aides on Capitol Hill were describing the override effort as a clean rebuke to a move that had tried to turn border infrastructure into a political weapon. Lawmakers said the message was not subtle. The president can pressure, posture, and sell a crisis, but he cannot casually convert shared trade corridors into leverage without Congress stepping in. One senior aide called it the kind of vote that tells future administrations the room is not empty. The practical stakes were immediate. Industry groups had already warned that even a short disruption would have rippled through auto assembly lines, farm shipments, and just-in-time delivery contracts on both sides of the border. Analysts said the bigger issue now is not the directive itself, but the precedent it tried to set. That emergency authority could be stretched into a standing tool for trade coercion. That idea, officials and legal scholars said, is exactly what Congress just refused to normalize. Canada's restrained response also changed the political math. Ottawa declined to escalate, declined to mirror the rhetoric, and declined to hand Washington a face-saving excuse for the standoff. Instead, Canadian officials kept repeating the same line: the crossings remain open, the rules remain in place, and the system works when both governments act like adults in a week full of noise. The calm looked less like passivity and more like strategy. The fallout now shifts to the White House, where the directive's defeat leaves questions about judgment, legal exposure, and whether federal agencies were pushed into planning around an order that was never going to survive contact with Congress. Business leaders are already treating the episode as a warning that border policy can no longer be assumed to be stable when it is being used as a political prop for companies moving billions of dollars in goods. That is not a small footnote. It is a risk premium. Constitutional lawyers said the episode will likely be remembered less for the directive than for the speed with which institutions moved to contain it. This was a test of whether executive overreach could become routine, one scholar said. Congress answered no. The system, not Canada, stopped Trump.